Really? No, it is. It's got a dum-pa-dum-pa-dum-pum. What's the name of that?
Living in the sunlight, loving in the moonlight.
Is that an original?
From the moment Tiny Tim stepped onto that stage, America was captivated. A man draped in old-fashioned suits, strumming a ukulele, and singing in an eerie, high-pitched falsetto. He was unlike anything the world had ever seen. But behind the quirky persona and television fame, a far darker story was unfolding. A secret obsession, an unraveling marriage, and a shocking request that left his new bride speechless. This is the story of how Hollywood's most peculiar star rose to fame, only to watch it all slip away in the most bizarre and heartbreaking way. Tiny Tim, born Herbert Buckingham Corey in 1932, was never meant to fit in. Raised in a home blending Lebanese Catholic and Polish Jewish traditions, he spent his childhood lost in a world of old music. While other kids played outside, he pored over sheet music from the early 1900s, endlessly playing songs on his father's gramophone. The moment he discovered his falsetto voice, everything changed. It was strange, haunting, and utterly unique, his golden ticket to standing out. By the 1950s, Tiny Tim had embraced his eccentricity, painting his face white like a silent film star and growing his hair long, scandalous for a man at the time. His mother was horrified, even considering having him institutionalized, but he was determined. He played in dive bars and oddball venues, performing 6-hour sets for barely enough to survive. Audiences weren't sure whether to laugh or applaud, but that confusion was exactly what made him unforgettable. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1968, Tiny Tim appeared on the hit show Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. With a trembling falsetto, he launched into Tiptoe Through the Tulips, and America lost its mind. Was he a joke? A genius? Nobody knew for sure, but everyone was talking about him. Soon, he was everywhere, topping the Billboard charts, signing record deals, and making TV appearances. One man who couldn't get enough of him? Johnny Carson. Carson was fascinated by Tiny Tim's oddball charm, inviting him onto The Tonight Show more than 20 times. But nothing could prepare audiences for what happened on December 17, 1969, in a live television event that drew an astonishing 45 million viewers, more than the royal wedding of Prince William and Kate Middleton decades later. Tiny Tim married 17-year-old Victoria May Budinger, better known as Miss Vicky. The wedding was a spectacle: 10,000 tulips, milk and honey toasts, and a nationwide audience watching in awe. But while the cameras captured a fairy tale, reality was far from it. The moment they stepped into the limousine after the ceremony, Tiny Tim made a confession that sent shockwaves through his new bride. He wanted an open marriage. Miss Vicky was stunned. This was the same man who had spoken endlessly about purity, faith, and saving himself for marriage. And now, mere hours after saying, "I do," he was asking for the freedom to see other women. The cracks had formed long before their vows. Tiny Tim had always been a man torn between devotion and desire. Even during his engagement, he nearly left Miss Vicky for another woman. He spoke about love in poetic, almost worshipful terms, placing women on a pedestal. Yet he could never seem to stay faithful. The wedding had propelled his fame to new heights, but it had also sealed his fate. The more the world obsessed over his peculiar persona, the more his personal life crumbled behind the scenes. As his marriage unraveled, so did his grip on the spotlight. The world that once embraced his oddness began to turn away. His routines became more extreme: 6 showers a day, brushing his teeth with 3 different toothpaste brands, refusing to use public restrooms to the point of walking miles just to return home. His eating habits? Even stranger. He avoided dining in front of others, preferring to eat alone, following rituals so rigid they baffled even those closest to him. Hollywood, always hungry for the next big thing, moved on. The same industry that had once celebrated his quirkiness now saw him as outdated, a relic of a fading novelty. As Tiny Tim's career dwindled, so did his marriage. Though they remained legally bound for 8 years, the reality was that their relationship ended within 2. Miss Vicky wanted stability. Tiny Tim wanted a world that existed only in his imagination. He drifted further into obscurity, living in a strange bubble of old records, rigid routines, and memories of a time when he was the man everyone was talking about. The man who had married in front of 45 million people, who had once been Hollywood's most unlikely sensation, now found himself struggling to keep even a fraction of that attention. But what really happened in the final days of his career? Why was Tiny Tim quietly pushed out of Hollywood? And what was the shocking truth behind his final, fateful performance? Stick around, because the next part of this story is even more unbelievable. Even at the peak of his fame, Tiny Tim was an enigma, a performer who never truly fit the mold of Hollywood's glittering elite. His eccentricity was both his greatest asset and his downfall. He lived by a set of strict, almost bizarre personal rules, eating only raw vegetables and honey, avoiding anything processed, and even structuring his relationships in ways that baffled those around him. 3 marriages, yet never fully committing to sharing a home with any of his wives. His first marriage to Miss Vicky was a spectacle, but behind the scenes, the cracks formed early. She longed for stability. He thrived in chaos. His second wife, Jan, lasted only months before separation, though they remained legally bound for over a decade. Even with his third wife, Susan, the pattern repeated, married but living apart. But why? Tiny Tim himself admitted he loved the thrill of romance, but once the excitement wore off, he drifted away. Was he chasing love or running from it? But what's even more shocking is how Hollywood turned on him. Once a beloved oddity, he soon found himself the butt of cruel jokes, his image twisted in satirical magazines. The very audience that once cheered for him now mocked him. His record label, once eager to capitalize on his quirky charm, abandoned him after just 3 albums. His Grammy-nominated children's album couldn't save his career. By the 1970s, Tiny Tim was no longer a chart-topping novelty. He was an outcast, and yet he refused to disappear. He played wherever he could, tiny venues, circus acts, even Australian television. He was determined to prove he was more than a gimmick, but the industry had already decided his fate. Then came the Luna Park performance in 1979, a moment meant to be triumphant, but one that spiraled into mystery. Tiny Tim set a world record for the longest non-stop professional singing marathon, a feat orchestrated by Australian artist Martin Sharp. But just months later, a fire tore through Luna Park, killing 7 people. Sharp was convinced there was a connection, even suspecting arson. He dedicated years to investigating the fire, intertwining it with Tiny Tim's legacy in an unfinished documentary, Street of Dreams. Was it mere coincidence, or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface? Tiny Tim never stopped chasing the spotlight, even when his health was crumbling. Diagnosed with congestive heart failure and diabetes, doctors warned him repeatedly to slow down. But how do you stop when performing is all you've ever known? In September 1996, he collapsed on stage at a ukulele festival, a moment that should have been a wake-up call. But just weeks later, he was back on stage. And that final performance, it was eerily poetic. He took the stage at a Minneapolis benefit gala, despite feeling unwell. As the night dwindled and most of the audience had already left, he sang his most famous song, Tiptoe Through the Tulips. Mid-performance, his body gave out. He collapsed, unconscious. His wife, Susan, rushed to him, but he never woke up. At 11:20 p.m., Tiny Tim was pronounced dead. His doctors had warned him. His body had begged him, but he had only one way of living, with music, until his very last breath. But Tiny Tim's story didn't end there. In the years following his death, his work saw a resurgence. Lost recordings surfaced, long-forgotten performances were unearthed, and biographies chronicled his bizarre yet fascinating life. So, was Tiny Tim a misunderstood genius, or simply a man who refused to conform? His life was filled with paradoxes, his career a whirlwind of highs and devastating lows. But one thing remains undeniable. He lived and died on his own terms. And that, more than anything, is why his story continues to captivate the world.